Hey, how's it going, everybody? This is the Conscious Bodybuilding Podcast, and today I have Stephen Dexter on. Stephen, would you mind introducing yourself to my audience? Give kind of like a brief rundown of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Stephen Dexter. I live in Missoula, Montana. I'm a bodybuilder, natural bodybuilder, and I also coach bodybuilding. I just wrapped up my second competitive season where I did two shows, one drug tested show and one NPC show. Um, I've been coaching for uh, 5 years now. And I've been competing also for 5 years as well. And yeah, that's kind of my very quick summary, I guess. My a little bit more on my background. I got my undergraduate degree in integrated physiology, which is a very fancy way of just saying exercise science. Like when they handed me my diploma, they gave me a checkbox and they're like, "Do you want exercise science or integrated physiology?" And I picked the one that sounded more sciencey. So there's literally no difference in the degrees.
Yeah, yeah.
So I went that route, and I was thinking about grad school, and I talked to one of my advisors. He said give it time and really think about it and decide where you'd want to go and that sort of thing. So in the
Okay,
meantime, decided to pull the trigger on a contest prep, and it had been a long time coming, and yeah, it was a really good experience.
that's awesome. Yeah, so I have a couple questions for you. What were the outcomes of those shows, first and foremost?
Yeah, so the first show I did, I actually wasn't originally planning on doing. I had a couple of clients in that show, and they wanted me to compete with them. It's a local show here in my hometown, and I had two local clients, and they were both doing classic physique, and they were just like, "How cool would it be if all of us compete at the same time?" And so I wasn't quite ready to step, like I
Yeah, yeah.
wasn't ready to step on stage. And if you go in the pic, if you find the Instagram pictures, you can tell. Um, but I ended up still placing second, which was really cool in classic physique,
Nice.
which was, it's a smaller NPC show here in Montana, so nothing too crazy. But it was a really, maybe I came in third. It could have been third. Don't hold me to that. It's
No, yeah.
one of the two.
Regardless for an
Yeah.
NPC show, that's really, really good, especially for a natural competitor, right?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think, obviously being not being enhanced, like the muscle mass isn't quite up to snuff with a lot of the other guys, and my conditioning definitely could have been better. But the guy who won actually was natural,
Oh,
which
wow.
was super cool to see. He's a friend of mine from
That's awesome.
actually another town in Montana, so that was really cool to see. And but yeah, just luckily my strongest point is my posing, and since it's classic, that's so heavily emphasized, and at the amateur level, it's one of those things where a lot of people are not really great on their posing, especially like a local NPC show. So
Yeah,
that carried me a lot, like a lot. So
yeah.
that one went well, and then the next one I did was the Natural Columbia Classic, and that was in Auburn, Washington, just outside of Seattle. And that one I took the overall in, but there ended up not being as many competitors as I was hoping for. So that one was, it was a little bit of a mixed bag. It seems like across the natural competitive world this year, there was like a very low turnout for competitors for whatever reason.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, not. I have a theory as to why, but it's neither here nor there. But yeah, I ended up taking the overall there, which was really cool. And I was thinking about doing another show, but I had started my diet. At this point, it was early June, and I had started my diet in mid October, and so
Yeah.
I was done. If there was a show like the week after that wasn't super far to travel, I would have done it. But being in Montana, any show that I pick, I'm gonna have to travel for. Even like the closest the closest shows are still 6 to 8 hour drives for me. And
Oh,
flights in and out of Missoula are crazy expensive. So for me, it was a logistics thing.
yeah, yeah.
But
Fair enough. Fair enough. No, I mean, I think that's a long time. Was this your first time doing a prep or getting to that level of conditioning?
yes, I would say yes. My first contest season, I did with a coach, and he had a very old school style. Um,
Mhm.
Bad experience. That's actually what made me decide to want to get into coaching. Um,
Yeah,
but
it's funny. That's the same reason I got into coaching.
yeah, I've talked to a lot of people who end up on the evidence-based side, and it seems like so many people come from having being burned by an old school mentality that drove them
Right.
into the dirt or something like that.
Well, I think it's also selection bias, right? Because the people who end up working with those coaches and staying with those coaches and never trying to try a different style is because they can handle that level of that mentality that comes along with it, and the grind yourself into a pulp kind of deal. There's a certain type of person that coaching style just works for, right? And I think
Yeah.
where you get the selection bias is the people who maybe aren't as genetically gifted, or they just start to question things, or from myself, it just didn't work with me, my psychology, right? So there's a number of reasons, but I think that's a big part, is like the reason those people even still coach people is because there are people out there who do respond to that to some degree. I mean,
Mhm.
or at least are receptive to it, I guess.
Yeah. For me, the biggest issue I've always had with like that whole mentality is it seems like they make it harder than it needs to be. And
Yeah, yeah,
my
I agree.
and I think you probably reflect this mantra, but it's like I think contest prep is going to be hard. There's no way around it. It's already
Yes,
going to be hard. But making it harder than it needs to be is just really stupid. And
100%.
there's just no sense. You've only got so many hours in the day, and it's like if you don't need to do 2 hour long cardio sessions on top of 2 hours of training, then that's 2 hours you could be spending with your family or doing something else.
Right, right.
There's
Well, it's comes with bodybuilding culture. Unfortunately, that's still something that persists. And it's going to be a while before that paradigm shifts. But I think, and this is where I saw the reason to get into coaching was that I could be someone who contributes to that shift, right? And you are as well, right? Anybody who
Mhm.
is a type of practitioner who's a little more evidence based is saying like, hey, like there's a time and a place to work hard, but like let's work smart as well. And this isn't a suffering contest. This is a lot of things, and to suffer needlessly is kind of an act in futility and whatnot. But yeah, so that's kind
Yeah.
of, I agree with that 100%. And that's interesting. So and I'm in the same boat where I had a season, this is the leanest I ever got, and I think towards the end I needed to reflect, and as I was getting towards the end there, I kind of, I think you over time kind of gain that experience and are able to maybe have those longer seasons. Some people just psychologically can handle it, but for myself, I needed some time to kind of reassess. Like if I threw in like a maintenance phase in the middle, or had taken some time, like right now, training's amazing. I think that you get in this place after dieting for a while where you're kind of like, right, I need some time away from this, because the enjoyment factor kind of gets sucked out of it, at least. And that's what it was for me, at least. But so that being said, I mean, the topic of this podcast is self-coaching. So
Mhm.
Stephen prepped himself for these last two shows. I also prepped myself for my last two shows, which were my first shows in 7 years. So I kind of wanted to discuss, first and foremost, what brought you to decide to coach yourself. Like what were some things that went through your head when you were like, hey, I need to do these shows, and things you considered, like level of education, considering the trade-offs of hiring a coach versus doing it yourself. Kind of what was your thought process, and then how did you ultimately decide that you were ready to coach yourself for these shows?
Yeah. Awesome question. The biggest thing that made me want to do it myself, it's twofold. So the first part of it was that it was a trust issue, because I had my trust kind of broken with my coach like my first time around, and so I didn't really trust anybody enough to want to put like my entire possible outcome that I could achieve into someone else's hand. Like it was something I was very protective of. Um, Full disclosure, I have since gotten a coach because over the last over prep, I got over that like wall for me. And but the other part of it was that um, I wanted to make the mistakes myself. so that way I would be able to better help people that I work with. Um, you know, like it's one thing being able to tell someone like, hey, this is how much, how many steps or how much cardio or what the training is going to look like, what the refeed's going to look like. It's one thing setting those things out for a client, but it's another thing like setting them out for you, and you actually have to go yourself, go through and check off all the boxes. um, not having someone to tell you what to do. So in a large aspect of it for me was I wanted to make mistakes, and I did. I made plenty of mistakes, but I wanted I wanted that full responsibility, and having like my complete outcome be utterly up to me, and have no one else have a hand in it. And that was specifically so that I could make mistakes and become better. And honestly, self-coaching for this season, it ended up being fairly successful, and it was a huge learning opportunity, and I took a
Yeah.
lot away from it. So that was really the reason why I decided to do the whole self-coaching this season anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think that was a lot of what went through my head, was like when you're programming for a client, and it's one thing to put some stuff down on paper, but to actually be doing the same things that they do, and also be trialing your thought process, right? Because now you're like, okay, well, I assigned this client 12,000 steps. Is that something that's feasible? Like, what are some of the challenges that are presented in my daily life when I program 12,000 steps? And when I program my calories this low, how might someone else feel? And kind of getting a feel for that, right? So now I have a lot different way, the way I look at my coaching, as I'm like adjusting someone's program. I have this different perspective. For example, like my thought process behind refeeds might have shifted a little bit, right? Where I think that I need to really pay attention to individual psychology, because I think that's something that would have benefited me towards the end of my prep, and something I should probably experiment with my clients and myself in the future. So that was one of many things where I was like, okay, this is something that I've collected this data. I saw that this might have some utility, and it's something that I will trial in the future. So yeah, I agree. A huge learning experience. Um, how would you speak to the like self-efficacy, self-confidence side of things? How
Mhm.
did prepping yourself affect your self-efficacy and your self-confidence, and maybe your confidence as a coach as well?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Um, it definitely gave me a whole new perspective on how I um, approach coaching in general. And the big thing for me was, because I had to make all these decisions myself, and there was complete responsibility for each of the decisions you make, regardless of how it impacts your daily life. And so what I meant by that is one of the biggest my biggest struggles throughout all of prep was like balancing some semblance of like social life.
All right, how's it going, guys? So we had some technical difficulties, so we're gonna have to clip this part of the podcast together. But when we last left off in the podcast, I had asked Stephen about how his contest prep experience, how prepping himself had influenced his self-confidence and his self-efficacy. And if you could just provide like some groundwork, and what actually what impact it had on you, Stephen.
Yeah. So the biggest thing that came out of prepping myself that was really cool and unexpected was just the ability to know that I could do it if I ever wanted to again. Hindsight and looking back, I think having a coach in my corner could have allowed me to, fix a couple of these little details that, maybe could have ended up in a better product. Just having an extra set of eyes on you is, it's always a good idea. And I think um, even when you do self-coach and take yourself through your own contest prep, you still get some input from friends. Like I have a few friends who are, have been coaching for between like 5 and 20 years. And I would ask them like, hey, I'm this many weeks out. Do you think I'm on pace? Stuff like that, where I wasn't having anyone like actually take over any part of my prep. But I was getting that opinion. And so when you get that opinion, and you have been doing it, and they're like, yep, you're right where you need to be for 6 weeks out, for 4 weeks out, for 2 weeks out, that does influence your self-confidence a lot,
Right.
especially knowing that you put yourself in a position to get to that perfect state where you are going to be ready on time, where you are going to be ready early potentially. So that definitely can be a huge builder of self-confidence for sure. And one of the biggest questions that I had, obviously we took a little hiatus from the last, and so one thing that I thought about over this last few days that we haven't been chatting was, how do you know when you can prep yourself? So what
Yeah.
kinds of experiences have you had? What kinds of tools do you have to have at your disposal in order for you to actually make the decision to do it yourself without hiring a coach?
Yeah. One thing that I was thinking about while you were talking about self-efficacy and confidence was that there were some instances where with other coaches, first and foremost, I had questioned their decision making, and I think that's never a good place to be in if you're being coached by somebody, like to question whether or not what they did was a correct way of doing things. And if they can't provide a specific, like, this is why, and a reasoning and rationale, then generally speaking, it's probably not a great coach for you, or a great coach in general. But I think there were a few instances where they had also sent over things, and it was the exact same thought process that I had at some point in my education. I had started to, learn how to do some of these things. And a lot of the time I would feel like they would send something over and it would be really similar to what I would have programmed. And I think at that point, that's where I started to kind of like have this, maybe I can do this. And then I think with myself, I also started to have some things that I wanted to try. And I thought that not one single coach would, every coach has a different way of how they approach things. And not one single coach would integrate all of the things that I wanted into the plan. And that being said, most great coaches do have some, it is somewhat a collaborative effort. They will listen to what you have to say and your feedback. But there were some things that I just simply wanted to trial on my own and learn for myself. That being said, the actual criteria I think to have to self-coach, first and foremost, is you have to have a certain level of self-confidence and self-belief. Obviously, doing this process, as you mentioned, did build that confidence for you, but you still have to have a good idea that you know what you're doing and also believe in your ability to do so and execute on it. And that self-confidence for me came from educating myself via resources online, mostly because bodybuilding contest prep isn't particularly something that you can learn in school. Like if you understand physiology and stuff, maybe you understand some of the underlying mechanisms, but more so going to resources that provided specific specialized knowledge, like Renaissance periodization, like some of the coaches that I'd worked with. A lot of these online, like for example, John Jewett's J3 University was a huge one for me as well, because it was like how he actually preps competitors, and that was light out. So that in itself gave me the self-confidence. And then that combined with the fact that I'm like, hey, there's all these cool things I wanted to try, that allowed me to say, hey, this may be a good decision to go in this direction. So I think that you definitely need to understand like the basic fundamentals. You need to understand energy balance, and you need to probably have some experience dieting, but not dieting to like really low body fat. So like just manipulating your body composition, understanding macros. I mean, I would say that you probably need a certain level of years of experience. I mean, I've been doing this for 13 years. I would say that you probably wouldn't even be ready at least 3 years into it if you had been educating yourself the whole time. And there's probably even more to be said there. I'm curious what your opinion is on that as well.
Yeah, and kind of to riff off that last thing you just said, you mentioned that even if you had been educating yourself the whole time, you wouldn't even be able to do it for at least like 3 years. I totally agree with that. And to go off of that, I think one of the other big things that people tend to mistake is in contest prep as a whole is they try to prep too early into their career of bodybuilding, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, you've been doing this for 13 years. I just passed my 12-year mark, so you got a year on me. But I I did my first one 4 years in, and I still wasn't ready.
Yeah.
4 years
Same,
of like
same.
pretty solid training, nutrition, and I still wasn't like at a place where, when you look back on your very first set of stage photos and you're embarrassed to share them, like that's how like maybe you should have spent more time in the batch cooker, right? Um, but just one of the other things that you mentioned was, maybe not having gotten super lean being a priority to do a contest prep. Um, I would say that, you know, getting getting to stage level conditioning versus getting to like 10 to 12% is a huge difference in terms of diet and in terms of you know adherence to that plan.
Right.
And I would personally argue that I think if you were to do it yourself, you should have gone through a diet that got you, fairly lean within, what you would consider 5% body
Right.
fat
Right.
of stage weight. So like those low single digits, I mean higher single digits, like 8 to 10
Yes.
percent. and
Yes.
and the other part of that is giving yourself enough time to have the tissue underneath the skin that actually pushes against skin and makes you look leaner too. Because we've all seen those people who just aren't muscular enough before they start a prep anyway, and so they don't have that. They have to get, where someone might look absolutely shredded at like 6 or 8%, and then they can get a little bit leaner. Like these people have to step on stage at a true like 4 or 5%, and they still don't look as lean just because they don't have that tissue to push to really like push up against the skin. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. Most definitely. And
Yeah.
they can look flat as a result, or just
Mhm.
not as lean as they actually are as a result as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of people sometimes when they're younger are more eager to compete, maybe a little bit less so now because of social media, but um it's really important to identify the reason why you want to compete. So like why would you want to step on stage? Like, I mean, obviously there's no real like, you could potentially get in this mindset that there's some sort of glory associated with it, but I mean there's no real like payoff except for, at the end of the day, if like I hate when people say this, but like a plastic trophy, like as if you win a show, right? Especially at a very low level amateur competition, right? There's no need to rush that, and that really comes down to understanding like what it is you want out of bodybuilding, and understanding, having a process focus versus an outcome focus. So actually falling in love with the process of building muscle, of dieting, all that stuff before you even consider stepping on stage, I think is really, really big. And it's something I try to encourage with a lot of people. I maybe even for myself took risks that I would probably not make or have taken at this age, because at the time, around my first show, I was more outcome focused, and I was thinking like, I want to be a
Mhm.
professional one day, and I made risks as a result of that I wouldn't, and it causes some issues with judgment as well. So I think really understanding your why you want to do this is a really, really big part of it as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think one of the biggest things that you need, especially when what one of the benefits of having a coach in your corner is they can act a little bit like the guy riding the dog sled, right? Keeping you moving forward, keeping you trending in the right direction. And you don't have that when you do it yourself. So you really do have to have a love and appreciation for the process, for the actual difficulty. I think there has to be a little bit of masochism involved, because if you don't love that challenge, that you know you know even like the shitty parts of prep, like when it's hard to sleep, when
Right.
you're hungry and you're tired and you're cranky, it's like you have to still find an appreciation, or at least have a reasoning as to why you're doing it that is more powerful than the current experience that you're having, right? It's like
Yeah.
having that focus on whatever your end outcome is has to be stronger than my need to smash this cupcake right now. And
Right.
for most people, I think they can develop a why that is stronger. Um, but it's one of those things that, especially when you don't have a coach and that like if I'm checking in with my coach on Sunday, right? And I have to go and tell him like, I fell off the bandwagon and ended up at the Wendy's drive-through at 2 a.m. That's a conversation you have to have with your coach that,
Right.
maybe that will keep you from going and doing that, versus when it's just you, there's really nothing that is keeping you from doing that. Um,
Yes.
through on my in my first contest prep, after the show was over, my coach basically dropped me right away. I didn't hear from him anymore right after the show. And so I was completely on my own to figure out the whole like recovery, reverse diet, whatever you want to do post show. Mine was just an all out binge fest. And because I didn't have any sort of structure, any sort of plan, any guidance, and I didn't know what to do, I ended up gaining something like 48 pounds in 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And I just had this like mass of water everywhere, and I'd push on my stomach and I felt like a Tempur-Pedic mattress, because you'd push in and it would just like stay indented for like 3
Yeah.
seconds and slowly come back. And it's like, when you're doing it yourself, you have to understand that, you know, all of the possible outcomes, anything that could possibly happen, because there is no one with, that experience who's dealt with, if you're a coach yourself, maybe you have, but you're not outsourcing that to someone who's dealt with hundreds of different contest preps, who knows exactly what all the possible outcomes are. So you got to make sure that you know all the possible outcomes of everything that you're doing.
Right. And that comes along with it is being willing to accept your shortcomings, because you're not going to know everything. So being willing to, this is something that was hard for me to accept, even though I had agreed to myself that it was something I would accept. Right. For example, I wanted to be much leaner at my national level show. And based on my calculations, I would have been, but my calculations were wrong. And I need to accept that. I need to accept that that was because of my lack of experience of doing contest preps. And because I was doing this myself, that was something I needed to accept. And even though I had agreed that it was something I would accept, it was really hard to swallow when it came down to it. Like when I realized, oh shit, I definitely need to be leaner, it was really still a difficult thing to accept. But you have to be willing to accept that. Like you may not, and it's likely, especially your first run, that you're not going to get the outcome you want. Right. But I did this because, for a lot of reasons, not just to compete and because of my love of competing. Right. I did this because I wanted to collect the data. I did this because I wanted to gather the experience to apply to my other clients. I did this because of the self-confidence and efficacy that it built for myself, like, or my perceived of what it would do. Right. So there was a lot of reasons why I did it. And that was the trade-off that I accepted as a result of, but you have to be willing to sit down with yourself and say, hey, if you wanted like, say I wanted to really just my main priority was get a pro card, which it never has been, then I could have just hired the best coach and I would have at least, I think, had a better shot for sure. So, I think that's a really big part of it for sure too.
Do you think that, if you do have those higher tier goals and the potential for them, and not only just the goals themselves, but you have, the experience, the genetics to potentially like go pro, do you think you could be doing yourself a disservice by not hiring a coach?
It really depends on what you want, right? Like, what do you want? For myself, bodybuilding isn't just winning a pro card. I'd actually rather it take longer and me enjoy the process and do it myself than hire someone who tells me to do everything, because the actual enjoyment factor of the bodybuilding, and I also learned this prep, was doing it myself, was being able to say, hey, I'm capable to do this thing. And I don't, and I mean, looking back just on my personal side, I don't think I missed it by much. I can look at the data and say, this is where I could have been, and now I can adjust based off that. And that in itself is exciting, because now the next time I do it, I know what needs to be done. I have DEXA, I have the body fat percentage I need to be, I have the mark, like I have some other things that I want to trial, and now I'm excited to apply those things. So for me, it's always just like about learning and then applying it myself, and then learning for myself. And to speak on what you said about having people in your corner, like I do run a lot of this stuff by people. I mean, Jared definitely kept an eye on me towards the end there and helped me with my peak. And I mean, I'm in the Team Full ROM forum asking questions. I'm in Physique Collective asking questions. I'm in J3 University asking questions. I have other people that I consult on Instagram that I know as well. So it is still collaborative, and I still have these other people, but I think still being able to, you know, take and interpret all of that and then apply it myself is a big part of what I love about this, I guess. At least it has evolved over the years to a big part of what I love. So
Yeah.
to not go off like on that long tangent, it really depends. Like, do you think, like, I don't think that my ultimate goal is to be Mr. Olympia. My ultimate goal is to bring a more evidence-based approach to enhanced bodybuilding. And I think by showing that it is possible, that I am doing that.
Yeah. And I mean, like, we've already seen, that even at very high levels, you can be successful self-coaching. I mean, look at John Jewett.
Right, exactly.
What he placed in the Olympia last year, like top 6, right?
Yeah.
So maybe just outside of the top 6. And he was probably the leanest guy in the 212, and he did it completely himself. He didn't have, he might have had like some of his friends like keeping an eye on him, but
Right.
he was very data driven, analytical, that allowed him to completely shape his prep by himself and do it at the highest level. He's
Yeah, and prep
competing
his
at
wife at
Mr.
the same
Olympia.
time too, who's
Exactly.
also a
And
high level
so,
competitor.
yeah, it's
Crazy.
absolutely, it's absurd. Speaking of that, do you think that it helps to be a little bit more analytical when you are coaching yourself? And where I was kind of thinking about this was, I used, like the app I used was Macro Factor. It's the
Okay.
Stronger by Science tracking app. In that app, they actually have an expenditure calculator that basically, as you track all your food, it syncs up with the health app on your phone and tracks your steps, and it gives you an estimated expenditure.
Oh,
That
nice.
I found that was actually super helpful. And so for me, I could use that data to be like, even if my body weight didn't trend down the way it was supposed to, it's like, well, I had been using this system week in, week out for like 6 months before I even started prep, so I
Yeah.
knew it was incredibly accurate. And so when my weight did lag behind, it gave me at least a little bit of a peace of mind that no, my expenditure is still really high, all the variables have remained the same. Like, odds are I'm just holding water, or because I'm stressed out, or I didn't sleep well. And so just because my average weight didn't dip
Right.
down, it doesn't mean I need to pull another 50 grams of carbs or whatever. So did
Yeah.
you find that through your prep, and I know you're a very data driven guy yourself, did you find that being more analytical was helpful for you to be able to make changes?
Yeah. I think you have to be, because um especially as you get leaner, your emotions are not a reliable um point of data to some degree. They become less reliable um as you become leaner and leaner, right? Your judgment is clouded by the fact that the physiological processes that are occurring are driving you to be food focused, right? And there's other things, adaptations that are occurring that, from an evolutionary standpoint, you're not, it's not likely that you can think rationally, because your brain and your body want one thing, and you have to use your higher thinking power to say no, right? And that in itself requires a lot of willpower. There can be lapses in that level of judgment, especially if you have psychological stress, you have all these other things coming in, which often happens, especially deeper into prep. So I really think that, like, I had conversations with a few people. Jared Feather was in particular was someone who I looked to, because when he had coached me into, he coaches himself currently. And I think he had made some posts, and we had some conversations about the fact that you basically collect all of the data that you have, the things that, especially the things that make the big pillars, like that make the biggest impact, like your NEAT, your step count, your macros, right? Your sleep and sleep hygiene, right? Your training performance, the big pillars, especially. Once you collect that data, it can really, it isn't, I hate to say it isn't overly complicated from that point, but and I'm probably speaking just because of the experience I have now and because of the level of understanding. Like sometimes it's hard for me to put myself in my shoes like a couple of years ago when I didn't understand all these things. But if you're looking at the bigger pillars, I think that you can really lean on those. And then what you do is you auto regulate. So now something in your data is not reflecting the way you'd like, then you make adjustments. So you have like this ultimate plan, like, hey, this is my 12 to 24 week prep. This is how much weight I'm going to lose. This is my goal body fat level, blah, 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 blah. You have your mesocycles somewhat planned out, and then you just make adjustments based on feedback. And that can be objective or subjective feedback. I just really think that you should probably rely more on the objective feedback, generally speaking, especially under times of stress, or take a step back before you make any adjustments. The subjective feedback can be to some degree photos, right? There's kind of some argument to be made there. To some degree, some body fat assessments, and then your emotion level of fatigue. That one was the emotion, the fatigue management side was something that I definitely had trouble with, because it's hard to say you need a diet break to yourself, right? Because you can try to, depending on where you're at psychologically, like I was having trouble justifying taking diet breaks when I was really, really fatigued, right? And sometimes I would push it so far to the point where I'm like barely can get up my stairs, and then I'm like, okay, I probably need a diet break. But I would push it to the point where, like, I remember one time I was at the gym specifically, I felt like I could barely stand up. Like the amount of effort it took to like move the implement of the machine and do a set was like almost, it was like a 9 out of 10. You know what I mean? Like it was probably like a 2 hour week, but it was just like, just literally physically walking out of my car, getting into the gym, the amount of effort that was taking. I did the first half of the workout and I was like, okay, I was looking at all my data and I was like, okay, like I think I have diet fatigue. Like my sleep's interrupted. Like I can't walk. Like this, I think I need to. And I went home. I had some carbs. I took a nap and I finished the workout. And I was like, yeah, that was diet fatigue. Like just having some of the carbs brought my stress levels down and eliminated some of that fatigue almost immediately. Just and the next couple of days was much better. But it was really hard to even do that. So that was something where you need to have plans in place to be able to auto regulate. So what's this? I can't remember what the term is in habit formation. It's not implementation intention. It's I'm not going to be able to remember it, but it's basically like if not A, then B, if not B, then C, if not C, then D. So basically, if you have something that occurs and the plan doesn't go as planned, you have something that you do and you just do it. Like, it's just like, hey, I'm not losing weight. It like kind of looks like a decision tree, right? If you're not losing weight and am I retaining water? Yes. Okay, do this. Am I retaining water? No. Okay, do this. Basically, you need to have those things in place. It does become complicated when making those decisions. But yeah, that's just kind of my rant about that. I think that ultimately you should rely on objective feedback, because I think that can be a really useful tool, and I think we should lean on that mostly. But there is some subjective feedback. There is some emotion that does come into play. But I would say ultimately you should lean into your numbers, and if you're feeling emotional about something, you should take a step back and probably take some time away from making decisions.
Yeah. So with I think both of us are probably in agreement that it probably makes more sense to lean on the objective analytical side of decision making as much as possible. But at the same time, it's like bodybuilding is about it's a subjective sport at the same time, right? It is, you do have to be like this lean or this muscular, but at the same time, there is that subjective component to it. So when we're doing stuff like, for example, with you mentioned earlier kind of having that emotional response to like whether it's the weight on the scale or whether you're holding water or something like that, and trying to be objective in that subjective reality, right? And so for me personally, one of the ways that I had to combat those types of things is I sent myself check-ins as if I was my own client. And so I on if you went back on Instagram, you'd see every single Thursday, that's when I posted or every single Friday, that's when I posted my physique
Yeah.
updates. But I took those pictures on Thursday morning and I didn't look at them until Friday. So I would
Nice.
take my physique. It would be just a video of me going through my poses, and then I would just screenshot once I locked into my poses, and then I just wouldn't look at them. I would just leave them on my phone, and I wouldn't look at them until the next day,
Yeah.
because I started prep looking at them right away. Like I would take the poses, I would look at them, and every single time I would get in my own head and be like, I'm not lean enough, or I'm looking flat, or like, why do I have like what looks like water retention here, or whatever. I'm bloated. Like, is there something in my diet I shouldn't be having? And I would have those little demons in the back of my head trying to, gnaw their way forward and influence my decision making. And so something that I found that was really helpful for me was not looking at my check-in right away. I would make sure all my data was put in on Thursday morning, and then on Friday, that's when I would go over it, and I'd basically treat myself like it was my own client. I'd be like, I'd be able to look back and see like, all right, was my sleep impacted this week? What was my rate of loss? What was my like total calories? Did I have a slip up day and go a little bit too high, and that's why I didn't lose where I was expecting to this week, and all that
Right.
sort of thing. And so I feel like, even though you can have this emotional reaction to some of the subjective nature of the sport, you can mitigate that by, allowing yourself to take a step back, or just pre-planning like I did. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really smart approach, because it also creates some accountability to the actual checking in with yourself. And then it also, I think even if you looked at the photos, I think even like glancing at them, which you probably did if you were screenshotting them,
Yeah.
still having that day to like think about it and not really like have everything at once is really big. Because I feel like when I was doing my steps, when I was doing my, my cardio, I was able to think through things. Like, it actually provided me an opportunity a lot of the time. If I would take photos and have an issue, I would go for a walk and that night, and it would really allow me to like think about, am I being rational about this? I also had my girlfriend, I mean, obviously she's not a bodybuilder, but I would kind of lean on her and say like, hey, does this line of thinking sound rational to you? Because I know that, again, as you get closer and closer and leaner, you are less likely to be rational. So I was asking her, and again, she's biased because she's my girlfriend, right? But still, at some point, I'm like, hey, does this make sense? Does this line of thinking make sense? And then you can also, again, go to somebody else. But I do agree. I think that's a great technique, and probably something that I'll use my next contest prep is actually delaying that and having that self check-in kind of thing. I think that's exactly what John Jewett does too. Sends it to
Oh,
himself.
cool. I can't remember. I think I heard it originally from Cliff Cliff
Okay.
Wilson. I heard it from somewhere. I'm gonna assume it's Cliff Wilson because
Yeah.
he's a G. Um, but yeah, he mentioned, like giving yourself that mental reprieve, because a lot of the time, I mean, you see it even in like altercations on the street and stuff like that. If people have to make a decision when a huge amount of emotions are involved, they're gonna probably make a decision that they later regret, right? You know, and so being able to remove yourself from that environment, or at least from that emotional, atmosphere for a small duration of time, and then be able to come back at it with a more objective lens, and a more holistic lens, when you can really see all the variables for what they are, you can make a much more rational decision, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think giving yourself the space to be able to make those rational decisions is one of the best things you can do as when you're self-coaching. I think one of the biggest things that you can run into issues with self-coaching is if you haven't prepped before. I don't think most people should self-coach their first show, personally. What do you
Yeah.
think about that?
Oh yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think you should probably have experience with a few coaches and have done potentially a few preps as well, because then you
Yeah.
can't really even develop like a preference, like for myself, where I was saying like, hey, like I think I want to try this or do this. That was developed over years of working with people and educating myself, and then wanting to experiment with different things. Like, oh, they did it this way, maybe I could try it this way. You wouldn't even know, where to begin of like, what did you like, what did you not like. You have to be informed enough to make those kind of decisions and calls. And I think really having someone else who has that experience, watching how they make their decision process, like what's their decision tree, asking tons of questions. I think that's really, really important. Like, how did you come to this? Like, why did you add in more calories today? You know what I mean? Like that would be really, really useful, especially if you have that in mind. Like, hey, maybe I want to coach myself in the future. Having a coach and asking them like, where are you coming to this conclusion?
Yeah.
I think would be really, really useful. I don't know. How do you
Yeah.
feel about that?
I completely agree. I feel like it allows you to realize what the big rocks you need to focus on are.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned earlier, focusing on the big pillars, right? If you don't have any idea of what those big pillars are, because you're so far removed from the actual like contest prep, because lifting weight and training to get big is fun. It's great. Like that's the part that most of us really enjoy. Contest
100%.
prep is a whole different animal. Like
Absolutely.
it is training in the off season is physically harder, I think, but the biggest mental challenge I've done in my entire life was, the 9-month prep that I went through. And when you completely do it yourself. And, I think if you've never been through that, you should probably have someone in your corner at least the first time to at least know what to expect. And you can, like you mentioned, kind of pick their brain as to why they're making the decisions they are, why they're implementing a diet break or a refeed, why
Yeah.
they're having you take progress photos in this lighting rather than this lighting. Because the camera can be a little dishonest if you take it in like straight down lighting in a dark room, and you don't know those things unless you have someone who can tell you them. And so that's
Right.
where I think, like you said, maybe not doing your first contest prep self-coached is probably a good idea.
Yeah. No, I think, what was I going to say? Like I was mentioning earlier, how I educated myself, even those
Mhm.
resources, they don't provide experience, right? And like you have mentioned, like some of these people have seen thousands of people, and there's still things that we don't understand. Even being as analytical as we are, there's still things that aren't explained by science, that just work, right? And someone who's seen thousands of people can look at you and sometimes make uh decisions on the fly, or even have an idea about what's going on before they've even seen the data, right? And that's a skill that is developed over time, that again, you would have to accept, because even if you're, like both of us are way deep into it, and we still made errors, right? So it's like it takes 20, maybe 30 years to really build that, unless we were coaching people from the absolute beginning of our journey, right? It's like it takes a
Mhm.
long time to develop that level of skill. So yeah,
Yeah.
no, I agree. I think that you should have at you should like bodybuilding is like always seen as this like selfish independent sport, but I think if you decide to self-coach, you still need a group, you still need a support system. Like my girlfriend was a really big part of that. People on the internet, because of social media, I was able to leverage that and build a support system, or join a forum or a group. And then you develop that support system, whether it's emotional support, which is very huge for recovery and for your confidence and all that, in your psychological health,
Mhm.
as well as people who understand the ins and outs of bodybuilding. Like you need to have that group. So developing that is probably a very essential part of it as well.
I couldn't agree more. And that kind of brings into the point. It's like, you're the one making the decisions, but it's not only you. Like I had, I had you in my corner. I had, a few of my friends. Like I have a couple of friends who are, pro natural bodybuilders, and I had them when I did have a question and it got to peak week, like you did with Jared. I reached out to them and I was like, dude, it's peak week. I'm not sure I can be completely objective about like how I'm looking. So
Yeah.
here's the data, help me out. And so in all honesty, really neither of us were completely self-coached,
No,
like you
no.
mentioned, because since you had like Jared run your peak, I had my friend Jake run my first peak, my friend Paul run my second peak, because I knew at that point in time that that's when experience is the best driver.
Oh, 100%.
You
Because we only have that like one peaking paper, literally, and it's mostly on specifically the science of like what I was saying, specifically the science. Like we only have like one paper, and a lot of it is what we think is going on. It's like not actual stuff that's been observed, or it's like case studies and stuff. It's very sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but like the data is very limited there. So it's like we don't have data there. So it's probably good to rely on a friend or someone who's has that experience, right?
Yeah, and I know Cliff Wilson has said it before that he has like over 100 different pro cards to his name. He's peaked literally thousands of competitors, and so like there are different peaking protocols. There for front load, mid load, back load. You can run a maintenance block straight into your prep if you're ready early enough, like 3DMJ guys do. There's
Yeah.
tons of different options, and it's like someone who has this crazy amount of experience, and that I look at someone like Cliff Wilson, who has just done it so many times that he can manipulate variables, and every single time he peaks someone, they look right. And
Right.
it's hard to do that for yourself, especially when maybe you've taken clients to stage, but like when you've only maybe done a dozen people, or even only 24 people, that's nothing compared
Your
to
sample
someone.
size is still small. Yeah.
Yeah, like that's not enough to write a paper in most instances.
Yeah.
you know
100%.
so
Well, and
but
I will say one thing. So it's funny about my first peak is I plan on doing it myself. And my plan was I have this plan and I will auto regulate if something comes up. But something unexpected had happened. And that's when I was like, okay, I need someone with experience. I had like major digestive issues on my carb load days, like really serious, to the point where I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna compete. And I basically like messaged Jared, and he like called me on the phone, and then he told me, and one, it obviously gave me some psychological relief. Like, this person's very confident in what they're doing. They just said, do this, this, and this. Boom. You have someone who's confident, who can just kind of tell you what to do. But also, I wasn't prepared for that. You know what I mean? You're not prepared for everything. And if I didn't have Jared, I could have winged it, right? And that would have had to have been something that I would have accepted potentially if he wasn't there or wasn't available at that time, right? So you need to be ready for stuff like that, right? And if those things sound scary to you, then it might not be something that you're ready for.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, another thing that is the benefit of having a coach versus doing a self coaching thing is, if you have like like a binge or something like that, say, like, raise your hand if you binged on prep. I did once. And it was one of those things where I had my first prep, struggled with it all of prep. Second like contest season, it only happened one time, which like I wear as a badge of honor that it only happened once.
Right.
And it was one of those things where it was just, I knew exactly what brought it on. It was just a huge amount of stress. I got some news about my show that like devastated me.
Yeah.
And it was basically, I think I mentioned it on the first recording, that that my show ended up being a lot smaller than the way it had made it sound, because I looked at like the lineup from last year, and they had like 8 to 10 competitors in like all the different weight classes, and I was like, this is a big show, this is gonna be awesome. And about 6 days out, I got the final competitor list, and there was like 6 of us. And I was like, I'm about to drive 8 hours, 8.5 hours to Auburn,
Yeah.
Washington, to compete in the show, and I'm only going to be against like that many people. It felt like a huge waste of time to me. It felt like my whole prep was a waste of time. Like, I was just devastated. And
Right.
and I couldn't sleep, and I was obviously I'd been hungry for a month or two at this point. And so, I knew it was going to happen. And for me, because I had been in that position so many times before, I knew it was going to happen. I said, okay, I'm gonna have a binge. Like I knew it was gonna happen. There was nothing I could do to stop it. And I was like, I made this kale soup. It's in the fridge. I'm just gonna eat as much of that as I want. And I'm just gonna allow it to happen, because otherwise I'm gonna end up at the Wendy's drive-through again, like last prep.
Right.
I'm not letting that happen.
Made a trade-off decision of like, hey, what's
exactly. Right. And it was like I mentally broke in that moment. And the thing that, going back to why you shouldn't self-coach your first prep, it was only through experience of knowing what would happen if I tried to continue to restrain through that evening, of knowing that I would eventually end up at the fucking Wendy's drive-through or whatever.
Right.
And versus like, it was literally like russet potatoes, kale, carrots, and celery in the soup. It was like, I ate like, 4 quarts of this soup, and it still was probably only like 1,100 calories, and yeah, it was like I was packed full, like I was okay. And then I could go to sleep, and I woke up, and, I had some like weird water stuff because of all the salt and water that I had the night before. But, a day later it was fine. And,
right.
Having that experience of doing it that first time, gave me that, foresight to know what was going to happen, know how to deal with it. Because, realistically looking back, I should have just woken up my fiance and talked about it, and, really discussed everything that happened. But you never know what these things are going to do. And there's so much, emotion, and especially when something unexpected happens like that, especially on peak week. When there is such a mental emphasis on peak week, it's like, oh, it's going to make you look this much better, even though we all know it's really not. It can, but
yeah.
But
yeah, no. I mean, I think speaking to that, it allows you, now you have that experience to really understand what somebody might be going through if you have a client who's struggling with that, first and foremost. 2, I think there's a lot to be said about knowing about habits and behaviors, and knowing yourself, knowing why we might do certain things, looking at the cues that might have caused that situation, right? It's actually a little bit more complex in that regard, is being able to understand and identify why that may have occurred, right? And you are able to, right? Some people aren't able to, or aren't able to, or just aren't experienced enough in having that level of self-reflection, and being like, where was I at? What was I thinking? How did I rationalize that behavior if it occurred? Right? Because ultimately there is a rationalization that happens, of like, hey, like in your head, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to do this thing because of X, Y, and Z. And I've already decided that I'm going to do it. So I'm going to mitigate the damage as much as possible. Excuse me. So you and being able to identify that is a really big part of it. But that psychological part, it can be a big struggle for a lot of people, especially if you're not ready for it, right? Because if you haven't done a prep before, you're not ready when that kind of like shift happens, where you become really food focused and all you can think about is food. And a lot of that psychological, like you become very apathetic and you're moody and stuff. I always try to explain it to people like who are around me, but it's really hard to explain if you've never actually felt that way.
Yeah, it's it's a very weird sensation, knowing why you're, potentially, like you said, being, apathetic or impatient or angry or whatever. It's like, the root cause of it, and yet because of like, these goals that you've set for yourself, or what have you, you can't change it. So you just do your best to work within the confines of that situation. And I think when you are doing it yourself too, all of the responsibility and all of the outcomes are solely based on, the decisions that you made going into your actual prep itself, that you don't have anyone else to blame if anything goes wrong.
Right.
Like when I binged, it wasn't because my coach restricted my calories too much. that was me. I was
Right.
the one who made those decisions. So uh, it was kind of a double-edged sword, because it forced me to take complete and full responsibility for it and completely own up to it. So like in the past, when I had binged with my initial coach, I told him one time that this had happened, and he made me feel like shit about it.
Yeah.
And
I had the
so
same thing
yeah,
happen to
like
me.
and so like then when it happened again, I just didn't tell him. I just didn't tell him. I just didn't
Yeah,
tell him.
that's not a good place to be in either.
Yeah,
Right.
and it just repeats this cycle of binge restrict, binge restrict. And that's what out of coming out of my first prep, I struggled with binge eating for like probably 6 or 8 months after prep finished. So
Yeah.
almost a full year. And it's one of those things where if it had just come down to like maybe my coach realizing that I was at my breaking point. Hey, we're 3 weeks out, you already look really great, let's just coast into the show, let's give you some refeeds or whatever, allow for that to occur, and realize that you know I think the other thing with self coaching is realizing where you are in your ability to bring the package that you want. And what I mean by
Right.
that
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
this prep, I do not have the cognitive abilities to bring as sharp of conditioning as I know I will be able to next prep.
Yep.
Just it wasn't it in this for the prep in this circumstance. It was not in my wheelhouse. I was
Yep.
close. I was maybe like 3 or 4 pounds away from the conditioning that in my mind I crave, but it was not within my scope of ability this time around. I know next time around it's possible, but
Yes.
understanding that maybe there is a time when you should pull back. And that binge was when I realized, I was like, all right, diet's over. Like if I try to keep pushing, I try to make up for this, I'm just gonna screw myself over. And it was
Right.
because like I wanted to push for that last little bit of conditioning. So I tried to put my foot on the gas for the last 2.5, 3 weeks,
Hmm.
skipped all my refeeds, dropped my calories, all that.
Yep.
And it's like when you self-coach, you have to understand those trade-offs.
Right. Right. 3DMJ referred to it as calling uncle, your calling uncle point. And I do think
Mhm.
that that point where you can't push any further without having physiological or psychological repercussions, it does I think it that's the one thing that you need to have experience prepping multiple times to do. Because I don't, outside of a few people there that have the genetic propensity to be able to do that already, um it takes experience to be able to learn how to do that, and to know where that point is. And again, that point gets pushed back every time you prep, right? I mean, like, I was able to achieve the leanest physique I had ever achieved this prep, but that was not my all-time leanest, and that was not the leanest enough to win a national level show, right?
Mhm.
But I also
Mhm.
had limitations. Like, I was pushing at a 1% rate of loss the last couple of weeks, and I was pushing like 1250 calorie deficit. But there were points where I started to notice that like binge like behavior, like because I've had them before and I know what it's like the food focus and certain levels of fatigue, and starting to rationalize the behavior. And I would have to, I had run the deficit so hard, but I also in the back of my head was like, if you need to bring your calories up so that this doesn't occur, then do it. Right. So I mean, I had already programmed in, you have these refeed days that you can choose to use if you want to, because your deficit is so harsh. But uh yeah, I mean, I also think that, like, whether that was healthy to push that amount or not, is it's hard to say. But also just knowing where that limitation is, like knowing like, hey, what's the trade-off right now? I can either push at a ridiculous rate of loss and then eventually binge and
Mhm.
look even worse, or I can bring my calories up for a couple days, recover and feel good, and then continue to push, right? Knowing that
Yeah.
is really difficult.
Yeah. And I think, as when you're coaching yourself, it becomes hard to make those decisions without um, seeing the other opportunity there, right? So
Right.
it's like I could take these extra refeeds, put my calories at maintenance for 3 days. Like realistically, I mean, you were in a hefty deficit,
Yeah.
and when you have the PEDs in the background, like you can be in a deficit that aggressive and still retain lean mass.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. No, the trade-off
And
is,
yeah, the trade-off makes it, you were like what was
I
the
knew
lowest your calories got?
oh yeah, they got down to 2,000 and I was at 15K steps. For someone who's 230 pounds, is not a lot of food. I know
Yeah.
some people, like, I hit 15K for 1,500 calories in your prep. I mean, for reference, I was eating almost 6,000 calories in the off season. So
Yeah. My lowest, and you're gonna think I'm a dick, my lowest my calories ever got were 2650 and my steps were 11K.
yeah.
And but
Right.
it was also, but I wasn't in a 1,250 calorie deficit. I was in like a 350 calorie deficit.
Right.
And it's just, I couldn't, if I pushed a deficit anywhere near that,
You would just
unless
lose
I'm
muscle
peak,
and
yeah,
100%.
peak fatness, like
There's a lot of other things.
everything.
Yeah. There's a lot of
Yeah.
other things that go into that too, like the psychological effects of like the stimulant fat burners and stuff.
Yeah.
I know you wanted to get into that. I want to ask you one more question because I want to get you out of here soon too. We're over an hour here. But one thing I wanted to ask you is, what did you learn from this prep? What will you do differently moving forward? And then what worked really well too?
Yeah. So what I learned from this prep is the biggest thing that I took away. And so I actually had on my spreadsheet where I had all my data, all my training, all that, is I had a little comment, a little section for my notes. And so at the end of every day, I would write down a couple of things if it felt like I needed to. And one of the things that I wrote around the 5 or 6 week out mark was start leaner, and that was the only thing I wrote. And I think that would have been the biggest thing that I would have changed was not pick my shows until I was like pretty far into prep.
Yeah.
And not I had kind of had an idea of when I wanted to do a couple of shows when I started prep, but I kind of made those commitments before I was ready to actually step on stage.
Yeah.
I think if I had allowed myself to have a much more flexible contest schedule, it would have allowed me to, take an extra diet break, when I was like, 8 or 9% body fat, rather than when I was just 12 and then going straight through,
Yeah.
and I think if I had done that, the outcome could have been different, could have been better. And so that's something I would like to do in my next season is, I started my actual prep at like 207-ish pounds, somewhere in there. And I got to a stage weight of 190.2. And so, 17 pounds in, I think 20 weeks or so, that's a very reasonable rate of loss. But when you consider the last 4 to 6 weeks was like maybe half to 3/4 of a pound loss per week, it's a lot. And I think if I had started closer to 200 pounds and I only had 10 or 12 pounds to lose from there and gave myself 20 weeks, it's like, well, then I would have had that option to take a diet break or a couple of extra refeeds,
or bring the food up coming into the show or whatever.
Exactly. I could have ran maintenance for a peak week instead of gambling on a rapid back load or what have you. So that would be something that I learned. What were the other two? It was a 3-part question
that you would do differently, which I think is kind of what you learned as well, like the things you mentioned.
Yeah.
And then what did you feel that went really well?
I think something that I'm really proud of that I did was I was really flexible with my training to a degree. And what I mean by that is, I had very structured training. I follow the same, RP style volume accumulation that I believe you do as well. And but in that confines, I decided to one thing that was a really big difficult my first prep was, the amount of time I spent in the gym, especially like doing cardio, and then I also was like training for like 2 hours. And so you're in the gym for like 3 or 4 hours a day if you do it the old school bro way, right? And so I decided that I was gonna take a session out, only train 5 days a week, and then I wasn't gonna do formal cardio. because, I work a retail sales job. And so I would literally walk laps around the store in between customers and stuff like that. Um, and so for me, it freed up a lot of my time. So that way, when I did have a rest day, or I also put both my rest days on my days off from work. So that way I could spend more quality time with my fiance. And so that was something that for me, I was really proud of that I did. Towards the end of prep, everything kind of goes out the window because you're a zombie anyway. But for, until I got to about a week out of my first show of the season, my fiance said that she wouldn't have even known I was prepping if I didn't tell her. And that to me was that was the biggest thing that I wanted. I wanted to keep the stress on me and not push it on anyone else. And then obviously, once I was really digging, and this is when it comes back to giving yourself more time, that's when she started feeling the stress. And so that's what I would like to change for next time. So I want to get to 3 or 4 weeks out before she even notices that I'm like prepping, other than that she can see all the lines in my ass when I shower.
It's funny because I would say that there's tons of overlap there. To work backwards from what you said, for myself at least, work backwards from what you said, I think that I was super moody in my first prep, and I've definitely improved on that this one around. So that was really, really cool because it just adds to the stress. Like, it just, especially if the people around you are stressed or like don't want to be around you because you're just not fun to be around, because you're just, moody and hungry and all this stuff, that's just not a great place to be in. And like you mentioned, like making time for yourself, like you freed up all this time so you can have some relaxation time, right? You could make an argument of like, maybe you could have stayed in the gym longer, right? Like let's say, like, just in this alternate universe, you could have stayed in the gym longer, and that maybe would have produced like maybe more muscle retention. This is very hypothetical, but at the same time, I think that the relaxation benefit you get from not having to be in the gym longer is probably at an equal, or if you consider quality of life, even greater benefit than doing that. Like if I did an extra set of forearms or whatever, I don't know. But I really think that relaxation component gets underlooked. Like I had a hard cutoff at 8 o'clock every night that I sat down and relaxed and watched TV. It's no work at that time. And then I started my sleep hygiene every night at the same time at 10 o'clock. Right. So I had these like hard cutoffs of like, this is when I do no work because I'm already in the stressful environment. I need actual designated relaxation time, or I won't take it. And I agree. I think for myself, starting leaner is a really big part. I would like to start leaner and take that diet break as well in the middle, because I think that's huge. I think I was like under the impression that since I was enhanced, I could get away with it. But I really think that at the end of the day, physiology is physiology. And I think that it caught up to me really towards the end, where it was like really difficult. And I think taking that extra diet break would have allowed me to have not had to push my calories as low, maybe to some extent, and it's not allowed me to be as psychologically stressed out towards the end as well.
Yeah.
But I think you had a question kind of on that side of ththings too, right? As far as like the enhancement.
I did. Yeah. So, and maybe we can call this the final question, because I think this is going to be a really cool thing, because, obviously we're both in the same sport, but we're on the two separate sides of the coin, right?
I'm on the dark side.
So, the dark side. Yeah, dude, the jack side, the side that fills out shirts, dude.
There's a lot that comes with that, though.
Yeah, dude. At least you got boners during prep. Anyway, so
hey, my sex drive was gone. I had none.
Yeah, dude. That was one of, I mean, that's something that I think is just going to happen to everybody at some point.
It's just funny because you're just taking so much exogenous hormones. You're like, yeah, I'll be fine. It's like, nope, you're still food focused.
Dude, I think for me, I never lost the ability. I just lost the desire.
Yeah, exactly. There's just no desire. It's so crazy when it came back, because it came back so strong like 2 weeks later, and I'm like looking around, I'm like, oh my god, this is what this feels like. I like forgot the feeling entirely to be like
but for me, it happened on peak week.
Oh really?
Yeah, because I was digging so hard, and then for peak week, we brought my, like, you know, my average carbs per day for all of peak week was like 600, 650 for all of peak
Yeah.
week. And yeah, I was like, oh my God, I felt like a normal human being again. And I, you know, had that desire back, and it was, you know, it was awesome. And then from there, it only got better, you know,
Yeah.
to now where it's like, you know, when you're fully recovered. I'm not, you competed later than me, so I'm not sure you're fully recovered yet, but you know,
Getting there for sure.
it is wildly different. But the
Yeah.
biggest question that I had, you know, is what are you think the biggest differences when you're self-coaching versus when you're natural and you're enhanced? Because I have my idea is that it's probably a lot harder when you're enhanced, because there are more variables. There are, you know, just in terms of the actual look that you can have, you know, you have these exogenous hormones that can, you know, cause like water retention and bloating, and, you know,
Yeah.
affect on your like digestion and carb uptake and stuff like this. And you know, when you're natural, you just don't have that. That's just not a thing you have to worry about. So so two-part question. Do you like, how does it, how is it different? And which do you think is harder?
I think they both have their challenges, right? I mean, I prepped at least one prep naturally. Actually, well, I didn't fully. I think I took like a pro hormone to retain muscle. So maybe I didn't fully stay natural,
Those
but
GNZ pro hormones.
I literally had to get gynecomastia surgery because of it. It was like the pro hormone that caused my
Oh my God.
gynecomastia. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
great.
Oh,
It was one of those, yeah, for sure. But so maybe I didn't even experience like the feeling of hypogonadism to full extent. And maybe you can kind of speak on maybe how that felt and how that affects training and all those other variables. It's challenging for sure. It's hard to say, like, first and foremost, the actual psychological effects of the drugs. I already have diagnosed severe anxiety. These drugs make the anxiety worse. So that for me personally is a really big struggle. Specifically the fat burners that are stimulant based, like clenbuterol.
yeah.
Thyroid hormone also increases your heart rate, which can increase your, if you don't dose it properly, or even the timing was actually something that was affecting me. Yohimbine is another one. That one really negatively affected my psychology.
Did you did 19 Nors affect you in that way too, or did you use them at all?
Trenbolone, yeah, I use trenbolone. Trenbolone, the biggest thing I noticed, and I use a very, very small amount compared to what other people use. Like I always use the clinical dose. So like when it was deployed in medicine, what was the dosage used, right? So I think I used like 50 milligrams a week.
Yeah,
But the
like, yeah,
biggest,
50 milligrams a day or something like
yeah, no, not a day, well, total week. No, I mean, that would really mess you up.
Yeah, that would be a bad time.
The fatigue that brought on just itself, it wasn't psychological, it was actually like the physical fatigue. And I noticed with a lot of these fat burners, maybe because they're clearing the energy stores out, like because of some of the processes, that they create a ton of fatigue. Like just I noticed immediately, I would take the fat burner, and this level of like just the actual having to carry your body is harder. Like walking up my stairs, I would be at the beginning of a mesocycle and I would deploy one of these compounds or increase the dosage of one of them, and I was just more physically fatigued. So that part in itself is challenging. So it's the psychology and how that affects you. Like for myself, definitely more stressed out. I think Mike Israetel has been open about talking about how it affects his psychology, and it's very similar to the way it does me, where it makes you more stressed, especially if you're an anxious person. There are people who get away with just based on genetics, don't get that effect. I think because I have an understanding of pharmacology and some of the mechanisms, I was able to mitigate a lot of it. And so what I did, again, large scale plan, this is what I'm going to do when I'm going to do it. With dosages, it's actually a really difficult thing because there isn't an objective way to dose these things. Like there's no like, here's when you need clenbuterol, and here's when you need this, and here's when you need that. There's just like this is when it might be a good time to use it. And so you basically just make a plan that's like, hey, this is my top end dosage that I can, with my level of risk, tolerate. And then you kind of just deploy it when you can, and then if you adjust, you auto regulate basically. So I had a top end of like everything that I would use, the most I would use, the risk that I was willing to incur by doing so, and then I basically just ran what I had planned. One thing was also like I mentioned, understanding the mechanisms. I took an ARB, which is one of the biggest things that causes water retention, which is one of the biggest things I can think can affect your look. A lot of people say it's estrogen, but it's actually angiotensin and the RAAS system, which bodybuilders, androgens increase this system, and which increases water retention. If you're managing angiotensin and you're managing that system, most of the other like effects are negligible. Essentially, then you just need to get lean enough, have enough androgens to retain muscle tissue, which I would argue is potentially even lower than what people generally think, and just get lean enough and retain your tissue otherwise, and then you're there pretty much. All androgens retain tissue at roughly the same degree. The actual specifics that you choose make a very small effect on your look. So at the end of the day, as long as you're managing that, maybe deploying generally contest prep compounds, then it's pretty straightforward. That being said, the amount of prerequisite knowledge I have is more thorough than most people have. It's definitely not expert level, but so it is complicated. It's just another variable you have to manage, right? You have, like how many, I think I was like 8 spreadsheets that I was looking at every week when I was doing my thing, because there's like the blood work too. Like I run blood work at like 4 to 6 weeks out, assess if I need to make any adjustments based off of that. So there's just more variables to manage. So it can be even more, if you're someone who second guesses things, it can be even more psychologically challenging.
Yeah. Do you think so just based off of what you said, that makes it to me sound like going enhanced and doing the self-coaching process makes it a lot more difficult, just because you said a lot of big words that I don't understand.
Yeah.
And or at least I do understand to some degree, but I haven't gotten to that section J3U yet. I'll put it that way.
Right.
That's next week's class. And from coming from the natural sphere and having a understanding of compounds, of the different categories of compounds and how they work, but like I the amount of background knowledge you have to have if you're going to like take yourself through an entire contest prep as an enhanced guy, I think is more than what you would need to use as a natural.
Oh
because,
yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and so I think
can't just like
there
take some tests and be like, all right, I'm good. It's like it is.
Yeah,
there is some stuff that you have to know how to use and when to deploy it, and the risks as well.
Yeah, and a lot of people, like what's the big common thing is taking like the estrogen blocking, and like because that's what causes water retention. It's like we know that's not exactly how that works,
right?
And I'm not going to speak to that because you're
I mean you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
That's 100%.
The only reason I know that is because I've heard people like you and Mike and Jared and Charlie all say that.
Well, and that's and that's where it's tough, because like to be even just an informed consumer when you're looking for a coach and you don't know those things, like you need to have a prerequisite knowledge before you even hire a coach. Like if you're like, I want to be enhanced and I'm going to hire a coach, you can still get into deep waters if that coach doesn't know what they're doing and you don't know, right? So it's really tough. Like you really have to be an advocate for yourself. I mean, I say in any situation, if you have a doctor or you're seeing a PT or anything, you need to be somewhat informed before you make that decision. The level of being informed to coach yourself is definitely way up here, but even then you should still have researched something before you get into that field and you hire a professional, I think, because like you can get someone who's crushing your estrogen, and then there's long-term deleterious effects of that, right? So
and I mean, like I'm sure you've seen those videos where they break down like some of the most absolutely ridiculous bunk cycles that people have run, where they're on like 6 grams of combined compounds a week, and running like redundant orals and stuff like that, just for like 20 weeks of just like D-ball and Anavar and Clen, like all at the same time, with it's one of those things. Like I think because the barrier to entry for going the enhanced route. And I think, as an aside, I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole. I think most people jump on that bandwagon too early or too quick
100%.
before they have the residual knowledge. Yeah, I think most people, hindsight 2020, would agree that most enhanced guys would probably. I wish I had waited 3 years until I actually knew what I was doing.
Yeah. I say that all the time.
Yeah.
But I think even to what you were saying earlier, not to interrupt you, I just wanted to mention this before you
please
move on. Is that if you also plan on doing this enhanced, you should probably have done a few preps natural as well. Because just like for myself, I mean, it would have been helpful to have had the experience of just dieting to get really lean prior to just to know what I was getting myself into. Because now I'm managing the anxiety and the stress of the compounds themselves, along with the side of getting like dieting. And I didn't have the habits or skills built to get really lean first. So I'm trying to manage all of those at the same time. And it's like, it's a lot more challenging of a process for sure.
Yes, absolutely. I've had, several clients, actually like almost a dozen clients who have come to me and wanted to, I outsource all of my cycle design to someone else because that's not where my intelligence lies yet. I'm in J3U for this reason. That's my biggest hole in what
that's probably honestly, and just say that I think it's one of the best places to be. I think he's I agree. One of the safest people that deploy these things. But go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah. When I said earlier that it's literally next week, I was not kidding. I'm in.
Yeah, I know. I thought you were like, wait, what is he talking about?
No, I'm being dead serious. Next week is when we get into the safer use. We're doing all the health monitoring stuff this week, and so next week is when we get into this.
If you ever want to talk about any of that stuff, just shoot me a message. I'd love to.
I will. I absolutely. I'm going to take you up on that for sure.
Yeah.
And but I've had so many clients who want to jump on that side of stuff, and I'm like, dude, do a prep naturally first. Make sure you even like bodybuilding before you jump on gear. You know what I mean? Like, make sure you like posing, make sure you like presenting what you did, make sure you like the challenge, because if you hop on gear, you get like 5 weeks into a diet, you're like, well, this sucks. Well, it's like, well, now you put yourself at risk for pretty much no reason at all. And it's like, you could just take, like TRT dose compounds and, have a stellar physique and look better than 99% of everybody if you want it, and have minimal risk. There's still risk with TRT doses.
But it's just, there's so many things that come along with it too. I mean, it's not a fun thing. Like, I just want to like, okay, like, yes, it's great to be big, the big guy. I spend almost 0% of my time thinking about how big I am, to be honest, as well. Like, I really, like, I just am who I am. Like, I don't identify as like this big dude, but like, God, there's so much stuff that comes along with it that's just not fun. It's a lot. And again, it's hard to portray that to people, like what it feels like to be on a ton of androgens. Like TRT, you feel great, sure, but like the sex drive thing, like there's so many other things that come along with that just are not. You really need to know what you're getting yourself into, for sure.
Yeah, and just knowing that there's all these potential long-term downsides that can happen, like especially you see like all the death that's been occurring at the high level, like lately. We've lost five like top 10 Olympia guys in the last 4 years. That's a small pool of people, and it's like, what's the big commonality between all of them, right? So I feel like there isn't this as much of this information, and I am fully behind people wanting to go the enhanced route. My personal criteria is do a local show naturally first. Just show up, see how you do, because if you have the potential, in my mind, like the genetic potential to be great, you'll still place well at a local show as a natural.
100%.
Like, you will. You look at someone like Kai Green back in the day, used to compete in the NGA, a drug test organization. Sean Clarita used to compete. He was a WNBF world champion in the bantamweight class. Both of these guys are, like second place in the Open Olympia for Kai Green, 212 Mr. Olympia for Sean Clarita. It's like, if you have the ability to, be great, you will be great regardless if you're on gear or not. So why not dip your toe in, see how you even like the whole process before you make that decision.
And then what's the rush, right? It's like, what is
Yeah.
the trade-off of waiting a couple of years and knowing what you're getting yourself into, but still loving bodybuilding in the process if you end up being the thing that you actually do enjoy and love? Like, there's to me, that's no negative trade-off, especially if you're already really young. Like, you have so many, like, most of these guys are in their like 30s and 40s hitting their peak physique. So if you're in your early 20s, late teens, early 20s, even mid 20s, I've seen people even start at 30 and be like being high level competitors at 35 if that was their goal. Like, I don't see the rush, especially if this is what you love to do. I don't see the reason in it. But that's again focusing on outcome versus the process, right?
Yeah. And we're gonna end up going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna pull back the comment that I had in my mind.
But I do, if you could, I know you obviously only have experience as a natural. What would be your perceived, like, what are some of the challenges, and what would be your perceived like difference in the challenges, especially based on what I said?
Yeah, I think the most apparent challenge to me is like you were mentioning, being able to be in like this incredibly heavy deficit, which has its challenges in its own realm, and you being able to deploy things like thyroid hormones and clenbuterol.
Yeah,
And like,
you have down regulation.
For example, when you're competing completely, there's like, people have like different definitions of what natural is. It's just like, there's what, like I think natural is whatever the federation you're competing in says it is. And so that's
enough.
my definition. I don't think about it too much more than that. But when the strongest compound you have to deploy is creatine monohydrate, it's like there's just a lot of I think thought and planning that has to go into it in the same way that it does when you're enhanced. Like,
you do have to be strategic.
Me saying I wanted to start leaner because I ran out of time at the end of my prep. If I had the ability to have compounds in my system, I could have pushed harder. Absolutely.
Right.
And because I wouldn't have to worry about things like lean tissue loss to any to a significant degree.
Right.
We see people all the time who they start contest prep enhanced, and their weight doesn't really change like that much. Like, look at like Charlie Zhang, right? He did his like a contest prep where he literally lost like 5 pounds in like 16 weeks because he gained like 20 pounds of muscle as he was going into his prep. And so there's you just don't have those options in play when you're a natural. And but that being said, I don't, one thing that I've seen discussed, and I asked you the question, is which one is harder. I'm not sure. That I think both are hard in their own way, because if you want to get to truly peak level of conditioning as a natural, most of those top guys are dieting for 6 months plus. That's like the Brett Freemans, like all these guys who are known for bringing just the most ridiculous walnut butt conditioning to the stage. And but at the Olympia level, you still see people doing 12 and 16 week preps, and they get to the same level of conditioning because they can push it so much harder. So for me, I think it's not about, it's like enhanced is harder for a shorter duration, and natural is harder over a long duration, if that makes sense. So there's
definitely
they both
a sacrifice
suck.
there. Right. Yeah, there's definitely a sacrifice you have to make to take 6 months out of your year. Different holidays and things like that will get missed, birthdays, stuff like that. I mean, obviously it depends on where you're at in your prep, but that's definitely a huge trade-off, right? And I agree. I think that you don't have as many tools at your disposal. Like, I have maybe a multitude of options if I'm stalling to deploy different things, right? Whereas you're just like, I have a calorie deficit, right? I have potentially my activity, and then I have a diet break, which can be limited by the amount of time that I have, right? And then you also at some point will maybe even need to take that because of the possibility of muscle loss. So yeah, I agree. I think you have less tools at your disposal, and it can become more challenging, and it requires you to be more strategic. And it's one of the reasons why I have so much respect for natural bodybuilders. And also, what was I going to say on that? I mean, I don't think it should be treated as like we're one and the same. Like, I don't think it should be treated any differently, really. But I do think
Yeah.
that like when I was first being introduced to a more evidence-based approach, a lot more natural people actually had periodized programs, actually thought about this stuff a lot more, whereas bodybuilders can sometimes get away with not having as smart of an approach. My argument's always been that you should always try to optimize things regardless, because some of these things just make things needlessly harder and you know, or you know, you spinning your wheels. But yeah, I think that generally speaking, I don't think that there is on the whole too much difference. We're dealing with physiology and then things like that. Although I will say that GLP agonists like semaglutide, I used a generic, so I'm not sure how effective it really was. It was mildly effective probably, but it's probably going to make bodybuilding for enhanced athletes a lot easier, because then they only have to manage fatigue. It's basically a medication that just eliminates your appetite. So at some point it's just at some point it's just going to be pretty much managing diet and fatigue in general, and that's it really. And obviously
that's a new medication that just has come out pretty recently, right? I think I heard Spencer Nadolski talk about it on the RP podcast.
That's what screwed up my peak, is I didn't pull the medication early enough, and it causes the slowing of gastric emptying. So I had food like into my esophagus. It was the worst feeling I've ever experienced in my life. It was horrible.
Yeah. Oh my God. So, holy crap.
Yeah. No, I learned from it. I pulled the next show and it was fine, but it didn't.
Gotcha.
No.
Is that what Jared said? Yeah, take that out pretty much, or
no. He was more managing on the back end. I don't think he knew that I had taken that at that point. He was just like,
oh, gotcha.
Oh, well, it's not a big deal, because like I was like on the toilet all night. He's like, well, you lost all your water. You're already depleted, and you carb loaded, so you're gonna look fine, basically. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So it actually worked to my benefit. It was just not a fun experience.
Yeah, that's not a fun way to be.
No, I literally thought I wasn't going to make it to the stage. So, I mean, and then you have that.
God.
It's just like side effects, right? Like, it's just like some stuff is unpredictable. You don't know how you're going to react to certain things. You could be like, I'm going to peak with this compound, and then it just completely makes you sick. I've seen so many people get so sick close to shows because of stuff like that. Like, so many. So, but yeah, we should probably end it there, because we've been raging for a long time.
Yeah, probably good call, dude.
I mean, it was really a pleasure talking with you. If people wanted to reach out, ask you questions, you also offer coaching, where can they find you?
Yeah, just shoot me a message on my Instagram. It's just Stephen STEPHEN _Dexter DEXTER, spelled like the killer on TV. So you can just shoot me a message over there. That's really the only place I'm at. I don't do the whole TikTok thing. I tried for like a month. I couldn't get into it. So
it's a lot of effort, man.
Yeah, dude. I don't get the dance.
Different animal for sure. Yeah. Right. Oh yeah. I didn't dance either. Trust me. No. I can't dance.
Well, maybe that's what we got to change. Maybe we should.
I guess
start doing the dance.
I think that's unfortunately an untapped market, because I think people want to see a big guy embarrass himself. So,
dude, I think you're honestly like right on the money. There's this the last thing I'm going to say. There's this one TikTok account I think is hysterical. It's this super jacked dude, and he like basically just does these like intimidation things, and then it cuts out, and now he's wearing like a maid's outfit, and I think it's so funny.
You think it's funny, and some people fetishize it too, so he's got both audiences. That's true. He's just capitalizing on both.
It's a win-win. Right, link to the OnlyFans,
right, exactly. Cool. Well, send me that profile. I'm interested to see it. Not fetishize it. Just
okay, whatever, dude.
Yeah, right.
Whatever you say, man.
All right, I'll link all your stuff down below, and get you out of here, man. Pleasure talking with you.
Thanks, dude. It was a pleasure chatting.